Welcome back to another episode of the Security Champions podcast. I am your host, Michael Birch, and today I'm joined with Michael Bargury. He's a security researcher that's passionate about all things related to cloud, SaaS, and low-code security. He spends most of his time finding the way things can go wrong. He is the co-founder and CTO of a company called Zenity, where he helps companies secure their low-code, no-code apps. In the past, he was headed security products efforts at Azure, focused on IoT, APIs, and infrastructure as code. He also leads the OWASP No-Code, Low-Code Top 10 project and writes about it on Dark Reading. Michael is a regular speaker at a lot of conferences like Black Hat, DEF CON, RSA, OWASP, and B-Sides. Now, I think better than me just reading off a bunch of blurbs of your accomplishments and where you've been, how about you tell our listeners about your security journey that's led you to where you are?
Thank you, Michael. I'm really happy to be here. So thank you for the opportunity. I actually started my kind of obsession with security when I was a teenager. I used to spend most of my time as a teenager actually playing video games, and I spent so many hours in this old MMORPG game where you had to develop a character, and I have friends there all around the world, and that was the first time I got to see security, because when people got hacked there, it was like game over. You lost years of your life because it's like it's your project and somebody kind of takes it away, and so the impact was enormous. And then I didn't know what to do about it, but about a year later, I had the opportunity where I was kind of studying computer science, and a guy from the industry came in and kind of helped us kind of learn security. He gave, and that guy at the end, I didn't know it back then, neither did he, but this is Adish Arabani, who is now the CTO for Sneak. So he used to help us kind of figure out what security is, to teach us that. And so I remember where something clicked for me when he gave us basically an application to try and hack in with SQL injection. And that's when I kind of realized how things are happening. And so that's kind of where I started. But then eventually most of my thinking as a security researcher and understanding of it came both from kind of a lot of years in the IDF and from Microsoft. And those kind of two experiences led me to understand and kind of to have both mindset, the hacker mindset, but also how do you scale it? How do you build an enterprise? How do you build it to an enterprise level?
Yeah, and you spent some while at Microsoft, about 6 years there working on different projects, right?
Yeah, I have. It's funny. Ask anybody at Microsoft, they'll tell you, well, I just came in for a couple of years, but it was so interesting. So I had a really great opportunity to learn from really smart folks. And so most of my time at Microsoft was spent as part of the CTO office for Azure security. Basically, I kind of walked around with, I joined a senior architect, much more senior than I am, and I kind of became his protege for a few years, and we basically try to figure out what hurts most for our customers and trying to solve that. And we were working with Microsoft's largest task customers to figure out what's missing, what's not working for them. And we spent a bunch of time figuring out kind of things like API security and IoT and confidential computing, really all around. But one of the things that really stuck with me is business applications and citizen development. Now, when you first hear about it as a security professional or just as a technical, whatever, professional, you're like, yeah, business users are there building things. I understand you can drag and drop things, but is it critical? But then you see a real environment. You see hundreds of thousands of applications, automations that people are building. You're seeing people on the finance team building a low-code app that facilitates their credit card assignment. This is critical business stuff. And if you think about it for a while, I mean, of course the business is doing business critical things. The business is where things are really important. We've been focused on the developer side, to be honest, because it's kind of easier. It's easier to discuss. I know it's difficult to discuss security with the developer, but imagine the conversation with somebody from HR, right? We're used to thinking about this stuff as a shadow IT and trying to play whack-a-mole. And now with low-code, no-code, and especially in the last year with Gen AI, I mean, there's no denying it. Business users are going to lead the next generation of applications. So that's what got me so excited.
One of the things I found interesting, and I had this conversation earlier when I was talking about somebody with Gen AI stuff, and it was the idea that Gen AI raised the floor. It basically allowed us to get the people that didn't have access to the ability to do things. They took a junior developer and gave them the capability to build stuff that it would take a senior developer to normally make, right? But now adding the low code, no code to it, add some Gen AI into that same process, and the floor has gone way up, right? People are able to do things with much less technical backgrounds.
That's incredible, and the fact that it happens, like one thing that I think people understand is that anybody can basically build any app right now just by talking with ChatGPT, right? You talk to ChatGPT, it will generate something for you. But I think the thing that most of us don't yet realize is that this is the reality in your enterprise right now. Because yes, ChatGPT is really impressive, but companies like Microsoft and Google and Salesforce and ServiceNow are baking in those capabilities, those citizen developer capabilities, directly into the offerings you already have. So this is a bring your own device scenario. We can say, this will never happen in my org, I'm going to stop it. Well, I mean, we know what happens at the end of that story, right? You end up having bring your own device. And here as well, you'll end up having to empower your users. And so people are not just able to build applications, they are able to work around with their entire enterprise environment in a way that was just not possible a few years ago.
So this is the inspiration, I'm guessing, that pushed you the direction of starting your own company around it, security with no code, low code.
So when I knew that I wanted to start my own company for kind of many years, and I played around with a bunch of ideas and actually a bunch of co-founders, a bunch of partners, which I think is the most important part of your story, like who are you going to marry? So once I figured that out, it was clear that we wanted to go at a problem that's interesting and deep enough so it will remain interesting for the 5, 7, 10 years it takes to build a big company. And so low code, no code was such a huge and untapped thing. We saw the tremendous potential that people have with like enabling business users to just become digitally native. Like think about what Excel did. Like Excel created jobs. Excel changed careers. It changed lives. Like low-code, no-code is another point on the trend, and Gen AI is now another one. And so when we saw that tremendous capability to change, it was clear that this is something that you have to do it, but you have to do it responsibly, right?
So what pushed you from the company to now, obviously the next thing I'm going to talk about, the OWASP project? What was the motivation that kind of drove you to say, hey, okay, we're at a point that we should engage with the community and start doing this a little bit better altogether?
So we actually started the OWASP project, I think, I'm not sure if it was before we started Zenity or before we raised our first round, but it was from the very early stages. Open source really, open source talked to me from day one. Like it's just kind of, I don't know why, but it plays on something in kind of in my emotions. Like I think it makes sense for us to, security is such a big issue. We need to target it together. And so I think as a company that tries to open up a new problem space, our number one job is to share the knowledge that we're acquiring. And we're not acquiring it alone, we're acquiring it with our customers, with other professionals. Now, we started the OWASP project, I think about 3 years ago, but now it's almost 300 security professionals that are part of our different groups. There are people there like Don Willets and John McTiernan and Yana Paris. They are actively like running the project, and it's just the best. Like what's a better way to learn a subject you know nothing about other than to share your ideas and like let people rip them off, like let people tear them to pieces. That's the best way to learn.
You know, something that's interesting to me too, because you're written from the ground up of a project, right? I don't often get to talk some of those. What was it like, the process of building a project in OWASP?
Wow, that's a great question. So first of all, it was like when we started, it was intimidating, because you grow up in security thinking about things like the OWASP top 10, and it's such an incredible resource to have, and like raising up to that standard from day one, like you can't do it. You really can't do it. And so first of all, I needed guidance. So I was really lucky to have guidance from people that just kind of helped me first understand that what I know is meaningful, and like validating that it's important, but also kind of helping me with the back and forth, like making sure that the thing that I put out there is meaningful. And I had a great mentor there, Ori Segal, who is now the CTO at Palo Alto Prisma. So he really helped me figure out like how to first think about it. But then the OWASP Foundation, I mean, it took me some time, because you just need to read things, but everything's out there. Like it looks like a big moat, but then like you need to follow a few things. You need to kind of you take inspiration from other projects, and then you get just like the only barrier is the barrier that you put on yourself to just release something for the first time. Because I mean, yeah, you don't want to release something that other people will say is not valuable, but really that's the way to learn. Like when I released that first version, like people reached out and they told me, hey, I'm missing we're missing something about components. Like there was nothing about the additional components and I was like, yeah, of course it's missing. And like this was just the first version. Now we are basing the OWASP top 10 based on, now we have data, right? We don't have just anecdotes, we have concrete data. And so it's easier to create something that's more robust.
Yeah, I can totally sympathize with that too. I'm a content creator in my own organization. So whenever we're making security content, and I know I'm about to say, I made an opinion and statement, and I'm about to give it to a bunch of technical people to rip apart. And you know how compassionate technical people are, right? They're super kind and gentle with their feedback. Absolutely not. They'll let you immediately know, like, hey, this is great, or this is horrible. What are you doing? Stop wasting your time, right? So they're very blunt with their feedback. So I could absolutely see some like that little bit of nervousness as you go to release that to the community, because you're gonna be judged by what you release by your community. So it could be a little intimidating at first.
I love it. One of the things that I don't know, it's kind of a quirk, but one of the things that I love is when people kind of bluntly tell me that I'm completely off. And so I'm not saying that it's like it's a fun experience, but you get to learn so much. So I think it's super valuable. And so when you find, like when we started the company and we wanted to find customers to work with, we were looking exactly for those people. For the people that you go on a meeting with them and you tell them, like, they care about low-code, no-code, and you tell them what you're trying to build. And they're like, no, that's not the thing you need to build. You need to build that. That's incredible. Like, these are the people that you need to have close.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the best feedback you can always get is straightforward feedback, because like there's a time and place to worry about the emotions of things, but I need honesty. If you don't give me honesty, I can't make my product better.
I mean, at the end of the day, we like science exists. We know that we have a methodical way to search for truth, but that way requires you to look at, like, just be real with yourself. You need to you need to look at data. You need to have an hypothesis, and you need to try to prove that you're wrong. And it's very difficult to do. In a world that's like in the real world, not the science world, where it's like very complicated and every customer is different and every environment is different.
Yeah, science world's a lot easier. You got constants, you got variables, you can track it all, contain box. You get in the real world, things get a whole lot more complex.
Don't get me wrong, science is very complex. Like, please continue to do your research.
Yes, absolutely. All right, I think this is a good spot for us to take a quick pause, to get a word from my sponsor, and then we're going to come back and dive into the core of this conversation, talking about low-code, no-code security.
Awareness programs don't provide enough in-depth learning. Ensure your technical teams are getting the knowledge they need to build safer software. Security Journey provides hands-on secure coding training in an application sandbox that allows developers to identify, break, and fix common security vulnerabilities. Give your developers the opportunity to recognize and prevent common and emerging security issues before they become a problem. Visit securityjourney.com to try our training today.
Welcome back to the Security Champion Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Birch, and I'm joined with Michael Bargury, and we're here to talk about low-code, no-code security. So just kind of really starting the conversation, level setting for some people that might not have a full grasp of what that is. What does it mean to have a low-code, no-code solution?
So building an app with low-code, no-code basically means you don't have to think about the app. You think in terms of what you want to build. So let's say you want to build, let's say you're in HR and you're in charge of creating a giveaway campaign so people can donate money to charity. So you need to facilitate that process, right? You need some way to collect information, you need to store that information somewhere, or maybe you want to create a nice dashboard on top of it. Now, you can ask an IT or somebody else to do it for you, but imagine having the conversation, trying to go to IT and say, hey, can you help me with this one-time thing I want to do? Like, nobody will ever help you, right? So low-code, no-code gives you the tools to drag and drop things, to be digitally native and to create that experience yourself, and then to share it with others. You don't need to think about things like deployment or environments or security. You just do it.
I think that's so empowering because what it does is it takes the development process and you unleash it outside of just the development team. Now people are able to solve their own business problems themselves, right? You're empowering. As a security guy, I hear that though, and I'm terrified of what that could possibly mean because half my job is teaching developers how to do things securely because there's a big gap there. People learn functionality. They don't necessarily focus on security. When you think about that across the org, now I'm terrified.
You're absolutely right. I mean, this is the thing is that empowerment is at the base of this. This is about allowing people to solve their own problems. And now, instead of just the top problems of the business get solved by IT, all of the problems get solved, but 95% of them get solved by the business itself. And so this is great, but we are losing something in that process. Security teams and other teams that are kind of central in an enterprise, they have a critical function because without that, an enterprise cannot move. A company cannot move if it's not secured, if it's not compliant. So you are losing that because IT is being decentralized. People are just doing whatever they need to get their job done, and like we can't really expect people in HR or in finance or in or anywhere in the business to have a security mindset. We are barely able to do that with developers. So the example I gave you with the HR giveaway campaign, this is a real example that we found in a real environment. But guess what? This application was built in a way where this application was actually asking for information. Where do you want to donate? Like which charity? And also what's your credit card? Because we need to charge you for that. And then that credit card was stored together with the entire form submission in a database that's part of something they call a personal productivity environment. That means a database that's shared with the entire organization. Everybody across your organization now has access to a table with credit cards for everybody who submitted. Now, I mean, people from HR should not know how to store credit cards, right?
Yeah, that's hard. That's difficult. I mean, there's a whole industry around that, right? We have specialized annual training for developers that deal with PCI and all that type of stuff to make sure they do it right. Now you have to span that across the whole organization. Anyone that might be dealing with that. Sorry about that.
No worries. That's incredible. The one of the things that's really frightening and exciting about business users, like about low-code, no-code security and citizen development and Gen AI, is that this is the scale of this problem is at least 2 orders of magnitude bigger than you're used to. Like, how many applications does a large enterprise have? How many applications does it produce in a year? Like hundreds, maybe 1,000 if it's a unicorn, weird snowflake enterprise. With low code, no code, with citizen development, you'll see hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. These are the numbers. I mean,
yeah, that's scary. How do you manage that? How do you track all those applications? That is hard.
Can you do you know how many you have? Let's start with a very simple question. Like, the answer is mostly not. But I think it is scary, but it also means that think about all of that empowerment. Like, it's really important that we don't get into a mode of conversation where we say, okay, let's stop it. Let's say, okay, they can't do it anymore. Because A, there's no way for us to actually do it. They'll do it anyway. And B, that's just so much productivity that you'll be losing.
So yeah, that goes back to the conversation then, how do we do it securely? And that kind of ties me into some of the stuff that we're talking about in the low code, no code top 10 project. I was looking through it, and one of the things I did notice is there's a lot of stuff that translates well to stuff we see in our normal apps, right? You see things like injection attacks and data handling and everything else, but they have a completely new twist around them because the concept of how these are going to be built aren't the traditional build. Like, the person building this isn't gonna, if it's a no-code business admin, they're not gonna write input validation. I can't say, hey, make sure you do concatenation on your SQL strings before you put it in. You have to present that problem differently to that audience.
So let me share kind of a story there, because it's not just the audience. It's also kind of, you get into a more of the business logic of the application, and the problems manifest a bit differently. So think about identity. Like, when you build an app, the first thing you need for the app is some sort of identity, right, for that app. So typically a developer would have a service account or something like that. But how can a business user create a service account? How does it work? How does the app that a business user creates, how does it operate? Like, a business user doesn't know how to get those permissions. So the only way where this works is where business users are allowed to use their own identity and to give it to the app. Think about how Gen AI works now. So Copilot works inside of an enterprise. It works by impersonating the user. It allows Copilot can act on behalf of the user and just do whatever the user can do. And so what ends up happening is that you get applications that are embedded with their maker's identity. And now everybody that uses the app ends up using the maker's own identity when the app actually does something. And so think about what that means. That means role-based access control is gone. Logs are gone because you cannot distinguish between one user and another. You don't, like, from the SOX perspective, you don't even know that the app exists. It just looks like a bunch of people have stolen that token, right? It's a complete circumvention of the identity and access of OAuth, of how identity and access should work.
Yeah, there's no access control in that. There's no repudiation in that. It's kind of broken a lot of our fundamental, just core security concepts.
So when a couple of months ago, or 3 months ago, Microsoft released something called Copilot Studio, which is kind of their version of GPTs. So you can create your own Copilot inside of the enterprise on top of your data. And so the first thing, of course, once we found that, we kind of started to play around with it. And so the first thing we saw out of the bat is that when you create a new Copilot, first of all, it's available for everybody on the internet to chat with. You don't need to authenticate, just chat away. I mean, that was the first thing. The second thing is that, like, with a few clicks, you can connect it to business data. So I connect to SharePoint with my own identity, and I allow Copilot to talk to SharePoint. And now it is doing that with my own identity while it's also available to anybody on the internet. I mean, that's the kind of power that these no-code applications have.
Yeah, that's intimidating. So So right off the bat there, let's start with pulling that string. What do you do about that? What's the solution to keep these apps running away with potentially super user properties depending on who creates them?
Yeah, so first of all, I say that it's not just bad news, all right? It's bad news if you don't do anything about it. But there is a great message here where, like, think about it from let's take a step back. As security, we've been focused mostly on what developers are building. And it's been very difficult. We know that the business is what's important, but it's difficult for us to get there. It's difficult for us to reason about what the business is doing. And so we do have a bunch of technologies that are trying to basically put guardrails on top of the business. Think DLP or CASB. These are kind of technologies that are, or even to some extent, endpoint monitoring. So you have ways to kind of put very broad guardrails on top of business users, but they are too broad. Like it's not granular enough, because it's very difficult to figure out what people are doing with copy and pasting all around. But now, when instead of copying and pasting, they are talking to a Gen AI app, or they are building their own low-code app. Okay, now we can analyze those things. Now we have a way to actually get visibility into the business that we never had before as security teams. We get to have that precious context that shows us what the business is actually doing. And so with that in mind, the first thing you need to do is, as always with security, start with the basics. You need to start with visibility. So you need to be able to answer a question like, who's building apps? Like, what data these apps are touching? How many apps do I have? How many of them are in a managed environment? Like, these questions are really important. Which platforms are being used? So you need to start with that. You need to start with having an asset inventory. Of course, that's kind of something that you could go around it forever, but have something. Have something where you understand the level of risk that you have. On top of that, you can leverage frameworks like the OWASP No-Code, No-Code Top 10 to figure out what's most important for you to address. So use that as an asset inventory, but then identify the components there, the applications there, and the developers that are using them that are really making that hurt most. So I'd recommend focusing on shared credentials, which I just explained, but also on data leakage. So you'll find plenty of cases where low-code applications are just moving data outside of your org. People are forwarding Outlook to their Gmail accounts, like things that we thought were solved, they are not solved. So that's the second piece there. But to your point, and because of the scale, you can't really rely on manual processes here. Like, you do have a process for this already. It's called vulnerability management. Like, you can think in terms of a vulnerability management program, and how do you manage those vulns, and how do you find them, and who's responsible, and the SLAs. Like, you already have that process. You can use it. But you do need to rely on automation from day one, because otherwise, there's no way that you can handle it manually. The best case scenario is to be able to set automated guardrails. Like, you need to make it very difficult to make a mistake. That HR rep that built the app that stores the credit cards, like, they need to either not be able to do that at all, or they need to be notified that they have done something wrong and how to fix it immediately.
And that's really important, because one of the biggest things, initially people reach out, and I'm a huge fan of education for a lot of stuff, right? But education can't be your only tool, because it doesn't scale well beyond certain audiences. There should be security awareness, that helps, right? But you can't scale in-depth technical knowledge across the entire organization about how these things work. So having the tools in place that are going to help you automate that are critical.
I also think that it's one of the crucial things about, we do have security trainings for everybody in an enterprise, right? Including business users. But it's out of context. It's very difficult to really get people to listen. But when somebody makes a mistake, somebody shares their identity with somebody else through a low-code app, or somebody talks to a Gen AI bot and plugs in something and data is leaving the organization. If you spot that moment, and you first tell them what's wrong, and you allow them, and you don't make, like, you make a big deal out of it, but you make it a positive experience. They can solve it on their own. Then you get the opportunity to now train them. Now send them to say, okay, here's our training, here's our security training. Now you have a context of why this is important.
Yeah, and that's something we call it just-in-time training, right? It's the moment that something happens, and for us, that'd be like I'm writing code, and then I run a scanner, and it not only stops and says, "Hey, you have a possible vulnerability," and it takes the moment to say, "And this is why, this is how you fix it," and take a moment to learn from it, right? So it's that same kind of concept, but now we're scaling out in a low-code, no-code situation for users building these applications.
This is really like this entire problem space of how do you create a security program that helps business users make the right choices, helps citizen developers make the right choices. This is what. So I'm really happy that I get to work with. Most of our customers are very large organizations, and so I get to work with teams that are like they are starting this new journey together with us. They are taking the vulnerability management program and scaling it out to the level that it can work with citizen development, and they are figuring out all of those edge cases and how does it work and how do you communicate properly. They're really incredible folks. So I'm really excited to see how this is turning out. But one of the things I've really been happy about so far is that the compliance level. So when you ask a business user to do something because of a security concern, they typically do it, which is incredible. Like we're used to having to have difficult conversations with developers and thinking about how does things work. But with business users, my experience is so far that they comply more easily and they follow along together with security.
I think this is a good point of that too. Is I think the hard part is being humble, right? And I'll throw this out there because I come from a background where being humble is a huge asset, right? Being willing to know what you don't know and being willing to be flexible in your current thought process. I will say people that are more educated, right, are a little more ingrained in their thought processes, so it's a little bit harder to get them to go against the way that they're currently used to. Where people that understand that on this topic, I don't know enough to have a strong opinion, so I might be a little more willing to accept advice from somebody that has that advice for me. So I think it's a very positive thing. It's interesting because I've never heard that concept brought up before, and it makes a lot of sense though.
It's also really interesting because I think your point also applies to the application security teams. So the teams they have to communicate now with the entire organization, with every business user. Like they have to be humble because they don't know what people are doing, how important it is, how much time they've invested in it. And those low-code, no-code teams, those citizen developer teams, they are the most incredible people you'll meet because these are people that have hacked their way. They are not developers, but they hacked their ways into becoming developers, it's awesome, right? It's pure creativity.
Yeah, that is amazing, and it goes back to, I think, and I've brought this up in so many episodes, communication is like one of our biggest failure points as security teams that we can have the greatest improvement, whether it's interacting with developers or any other business developer, citizen developer, anyone across that. The way we communicate is so important because that's the number one way we can have effect, right? Now think about
definitely.
So we've touched on a couple of other things. I would love to highlight some any of these other top things that you think were probably some of the most interesting from a low-code, no-code perspective that we might not see in our traditional development environment.
Sure. So let me give a couple more kind of examples. So one thing that people tend to ask is, what about kind of how are hackers seeing it? How does it look like from the hacker's perspective? So let me give you a couple of points there. So one of them, think about what low-code, no-code does. It has compute. It's able to communicate across your entire organization. It's outside of the purview of most security teams. Sounds like the perfect place to hide, right? So hackers are actually leveraging low-code, no-code as a citizen development platform for living off the land. So we've actually seen where they hackers that are putting in place automations that do things like use e-discovery, like Microsoft's discovery tool, to search for things like passwords and PII and sensitive information, and they just send it off to their control endpoints. You have that automation running there. Who's gonna look for it? Who's gonna find it? These automations sometimes overlast their users. So if you build an automation and you disable the user, the automation is still happening, still exists, can still run. And so it's really the best way to backdoor your way into an organization. So we've actually done a lot of research into the space. I actually talked about it at DEFCON a couple of years ago, exactly on that point of using it as a persistency mechanism. And so that's one thing that we're seeing. Another thing is that because of the capability of low-code, no-code platforms to connect across your organization and to do this user impersonation, they are essentially a bag of credentials. So every user will log into those platforms, and they'll connect to SharePoint, and they'll connect to Salesforce, and that's great. But then it's such a good target, right? And so you'll end up with cases where people are sharing these credentials with their entire organizations, and then a guest comes in and they scan your environment and they find the SQL server and they just take it. Like it's a sitting target.
Yeah, the threat landscape of this just seems such a large scale, just because the different use cases, endpoints. I mean, I can imagine that these make great pivot points for anybody that gets in your system, like especially with the interconnectedness that you're kind of explaining here. It's a perfect web that bypasses maybe some traditional security mechanisms like our firewalls that we consider stopping traffic. Well, if these don't respect that or aren't trafficked and followed and monitored, tracking that data becomes a whole lot more difficult.
They do all of that in the vendor's cloud, so you have no visibility, outside of the purview of security teams, with no logs in the SOC, with no security visibility or awareness that this even exists. Like, you have so many which makes this really the perfect target. But and it's not just, by the way, it's funny, but it's not just, we talked about business users a lot, and we just talked about hackers for a bit, but developers are using this too. So if you wanna unlock your own productivity as a developer, you have a process that you wanna run. Let's say something that I saw a couple of days ago. You have a process you have keys for production, and you want to make sure that when those keys are about to expire, you create a ticket somewhere which says, all right, let's rotate those secrets. How will you build that automation? You want to connect to, let's say, ServiceNow to create that incident. You want to connect to, AWS Secret Manager to get those secrets. How do you build that? You can spend the resources required to develop it. Or you can drag a couple of boxes in a no-code platform and you'll get it done, which is incredible. But it also means that you've now added a part of production into a personal productivity environment where everything goes.
Yeah, it's
a real example.
Wild West.
It is.
That's definitely intimidating to think about. So it's funny though, because we bring up these things, and they all seems like some really big problems, right? So as immediately, if someone were to come to me today and be like, "Hey, let's low code, no code in your environment," at the moment I'd be like, "That's terrifying. Why would I do that?" But once again, we talked about the productivity need, right? The use cases out there, people are using this. So automated security tools is kind of my only solution here. Like the frameworks, I guess, are good. I don't know. It just seems like if someone were to adopt this, you'd have to put some serious planning and road gates and do some thorough stuff up front, because I feel like being reactive in this space could be even more detrimental than being reactive like we are in some other spaces.
The problem with being reactive is that I meet a customer and they haven't done anything, and they kind of figured out 3 years later that the business is doing that. But then the size of the technical debt is so huge because so many apps were developed that now they have a huge thing that they need to walk through. And so I do think that now is the perfect time. So Gen AI has started like a year ago. This is we have another 10x here in the number of applications that are being used. now is the time to do something. But in terms of what to do about it, I think in that part we already have the answers. Like we just need to bring this into the security purview. We need to do vulnerability management. We need to do red teaming and pen testing. We need to do an assessment of these platforms and figure out which ones are better than others or provide more controls than others. But of course, you can't really expect a platform to solve all of the problems for you. Because think about when cloud started, people were thinking hey, I'm gonna move my things to AWS, and AWS will make sure it's secure. But of course, we know that's not the case, right? There's a shared responsibility model. You own what you build. The same thing happens with low-code, no-code. It's not platforms are providing building blocks. They need to provide good building blocks. They need to provide controls. That's great. But you're in charge of what you've built. So of course you need to own it. There's no other team, and application security teams are the ones that have the most relevant experience to target this problem space. But there are also a bunch of tools on the kind of attacker's perspective, penetration testing, red teaming. If you're looking for one, so there's one open source project that we've released called PowerPwn, which allows you to kind of play around with your environment, look at it from an attacker's perspective, try out that persistency mechanisms through an automation, try out to find connections that are overshared. You can go about it from all of the regular ways that we look through in security to make sure that the risk is clear and to get a buy-in from your management to actually do something about it.
And another part I kind of see on this too is there has to be a high level of responsibility for the platforms offering these to have really good and built-in security features and have them be clear and understandable. And I don't know, because a good example is I hate to call it companies. I'm working on, we're actually building content on Apex right now. So Salesforce's language of choice, right? So they're doing a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
So there's a little crossover we're dealing with this when talking about secure coding in Apex, as well as the idea of what's that mean for the stuff you're making with low-code, no-code type products, right? The interesting part comes to that too, though, is these components that we're building. I mean, there has to be a high responsibility for the companies hosting these components as far as what the minimum security requirements for them are. A good example is Salesforce has something we were talking about. They have to have a 75% testing structure. You have to have 75% coverage for your testing of your code going in, or else you can't even host it on their platform, right? So a lot of those different type of hey, you have to meet these bare minimum at least levels of security for the products you're going to be sharing and letting people drag and drop and use.
I think one of the biggest things that platforms need to do is to enable the rest of the security industry or any other kind of they need to play nicely with others. The problem with most of these platforms is that they are kind of a siloed island, and they make it difficult to converse with, and for customers to actually figure out what's going on there. They need to start with the basics. They need to produce logs. They need to have a way for you to see what's happening in runtime. They need a way for you to be able to monitor all of that, to create an asset inventory in their platform. All of those things, of course, platforms need to solve. But let's talk about Apex for a while, or Salesforce. So Apex has this problem where it's not just Apex has this feature where Apex code can run either on the context of the user that has run the automation through an app, or on system context, right? This is indeed a feature. There are valid use cases to use system context rather than user context. But of course, it means that if you use system context, then any user could see records that they should not own. And so the question becomes a question of context. It's not enough. You cannot just say you can't use system context. I mean, you wouldn't be able to use Salesforce. You need to figure out, this Apex code, which apps are using it? Are any of them shared to users that don't have access to the underlying storage? Which objects is this Apex code touching? Are they sensitive objects? Are they kind of metadata? How important it is? This application, what other information it has? Does it have SQL injection attacks here as well? All of these questions need to come together to get an actual understanding of whether this is something that needs fixing or not, whether it makes sense or not. And the story I'm telling right now might sound familiar because this is the Synapse story. Like this is the story in cloud. We're already telling that story, right? You have the graph, you figure out how things are going, you have the vulnerability and whether or not it's out there on the internet. Like this is something that the industry is already surfacing. But in the business application world, we are not close to it. And so that's why I think it's so exciting, because we can bring those insights and we can understand the context and we can actually make a decision on whether or not this makes sense or not. This is something that has to be a customer problem. It cannot be the platform's problem. The platform will not solve it for you, right?
Right.
Whether it makes sense to use that feature or not.
Yeah, that makes complete sense too. Absolutely. Man, that's such interesting. The original statement too that you brought out there is the fact that playing nice, right, with these organizations. These enterprise platforms, I mean, that's their staple, is their fact that no, you live in our environment. It's just our environment. We don't want you to do anything else outside with anybody else, and we don't really want people getting into our stuff. It's like there's a huge like mentality of that, which as a security community makes everything so much harder. Like it's why open source is so good, why OWASP is so amazing. We're out here and we're open, we're sharing, we're trying to build better together type things. That's a difficult hurdle to kind of come over with these type of platforms.
I think we really need to be better as a community, because otherwise we all lose. Like we need to be able to be better at sharing. We need to be better at pluggability. So people need to be able to use their own. Like when you go to when you work with enterprises, the first thing they will ask you is what permissions do you need, or how do you secure yourself? But the second question would be, how do you plug into the rest of my ecosystem? How do you plug into my SIEM? How do you plug into my SOAR? How do you, I want to see you where I'm already working, right? I want your signals where I already have a workflow. The same thing is true for like everything else that we're doing, especially in the enterprise. And these platforms, I think some platforms are most platforms are making a lot of effort. And don't get me wrong, like I've been working with many of those platforms, finding security vulnerabilities, reporting them. They're pretty awesome. Like they're doing a very good job to push productivity across the industry. What they're doing is really amazing. Like I really admire their work. The problem of using it correctly, I don't think it's theirs to solve. I think it's our responsibility.
Yeah, and that absolutely, and that's awesome. That's awesome to hear. That's great to hear that's what we're seeing in the industry, is that the platforms are being proactive and doing such a good job. But it definitely doesn't reduce the workload of figuring out how to get the users to do it right, how to get the organizations they're leveraging to do this correctly. Well, as we're going through this conversation, what other information do you have to impart on us on the low-code, no-code security as we kind of come closer to the end of the conversation?
So I really encourage people to be part of the OWASP community. It's more than just the top 10. This is just a way for security, for like-minded folks to meet each other. Like if you're thinking about low-code, no-code, if you're thinking about citizen developers or business users, there are other people on that group that either are thinking about this or have already tried to do things. Like we can learn from each other, and this makes us all much better. We are also working right now on the next version of the OWASP low-code, no-code top 10, which is kind of a revamp. And so now is a great time to pitch in. If you have stories about things that went wrong in your organization, if you have examples of things we could add, this is an incredible moment to join in. And so I think that would be the number one thing that I'll recommend. I also recommend people to check out PowerPoint, which is a great open source tool you can use to kind of check out your Power Platform environment and see how it looks like from an attacker's perspective. And other than that, there's plenty of information that people have started to put out there, including ourselves. There's talks online, DEF CON, Black Hat. You'll find the attacker's perspective there. I think it really helps to figure out what could go wrong so you can get the buy-in you need.
Yeah, I think that's huge. Like everyone here, I highly recommend go to the OWASP pages, see those resources out there, get involved in your local OWASP communities. There's a lot of people that are passionate about this. If you have a question, I promise you there's somebody out there that's going to be willing to help you get to that answer passionately. Mike, thanks for coming on. A lot of great information. I appreciate you having you as a guest. I wish you luck as you continue with your organization, as well as you continue with that OWASP project. That's so amazing. I can't wait to see what the next version has to bring us.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this. And if there's anybody that's kind of in the audience unsure about what to do with their low-code, no-code, reach out to me. Like, I'm happy to chat.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And to my guests, like I said, I want to thank you guys for jumping on and listening to another episode of the Security Champion podcast. And please join me for our next episode where I'll meet with another security expert. I'm hoping another OWASP leader actually currently on the docket. And we will deep dive and discuss everything there is to know security. And always remember, security is a journey, not a destination.